Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and welcome to another mod with me. Today we're going to be trimming and edging the Goddess Tarot. So this is a deck that I've seen a lot of people modify because, as you can see here, it has multiple borders going on. So we have the white border with the 1998 US Games copyright. We have the inner border that has the text on it, and then we have yet another border which seems to have some sort of background elements to it. And then we also have another inner border that kind of frames the actual artwork. So that is 4 borders technically on this deck. Not to mention we have the white border on the back, which really does stand out in comparison to the blue background with the gold accents. So I think that this is one that gets trimmed quite often. So it's really not going to be a new trim. I'm really not going to do anything like super novel with it. This is just the deck that I've been wanting to use, but it has, it just has a lot of border going on with it. I think that maybe what I'm going to try to do is trim it down to just these two sides and then taking as much of the gold border off as I can. The only question being, if I do that, does that mess up my back? And I don't think it really does. I think the back will still end up looking okay. So, like I said, for the most part, pretty straightforward trim here. I mean, we're not doing anything really crazy. I'm just going to take that white border off and some of the excess border, and it's going to make it just a little smaller, of course, which is always better for me, but it's also going to kind of zoom in on that artwork, right? Kind of make that artwork stand out a little front and center, because right now the white borders, in contrast to all of the darker kind of earthy colors in this deck, is very distracting. And so you can see here that we have a lot of earthy colors in this deck. We have a lot of oranges and reds, and we have this lovely blues, and again, it's a very earth-toned deck. And then you throw that white border on it, and it's just kind of like shocking. So let's go ahead and jump in. So before we begin, let's talk tools. I, of course, have my deck that I'm going to be trimming. I have my Fiskars trimmer. I have my Kadumara Pro corner rounder. I have my little triangle ruler that I'm going to use as my guide so that I can make sure that my measurements all come out right, so my cards come out even, and I have my washi tape to hold it down. This is pretty much my process. I probably need to do an update on a how to trim a tarot deck video, because this is now my new process and I use it for every deck regardless of what I'm doing with it in terms of the trimming, because it works beautifully for me. I get a really nice, straight, clean cut deck at the end, and it always makes for a better shuffle experience too when you get those edges really nice and even. So we're going to put that aside for the moment because we really don't need it. And we're going to go ahead and start with trimming the sides off of this deck. So again, this is going to be a pretty straightforward trim. I'm just going to take each of the two sides off down to just this first layer of, or really I guess that's 1, 2, 3, third layer of border. And then I'm going to just trim the white off the top and bottom. And that's going to give it a little bit more of a clean cut look. So normally I would do some testing with the title cards, but the title cards don't have the same sort of border structure that the other cards do. Even the information card here doesn't have the same sort of structure. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. And what we're going to do, I always forget to mention my ruler as a tool. And I do definitely consider it a tool because it is something I use every time I do this. So if you've not seen me trim a deck before, I have lots of different videos on it where I've trimmed lots of different decks. One of the things that I always recommend is to do one side at a time. That's how you get an even deck at the end. That's how you get a deck that is still fairly even and all the same size like this. Because by cutting one side at a time, you're pretty much using the same measurements for each side, and that gives you a very uniform cut at the end. And I always like to err on the side of caution when I do this. So I always take off a little bit more than I really need to, because I don't want any of that border remaining in places where I don't want the border. I've just thrown a piece of washi down here just to get this card in here so that I can start taping down my guide. Kind of got my ruler right where I want it. The washi just helps keep it in place so it doesn't move around on me. And I've got my card tucked in here. And I'm gonna go ahead and make my first cut. So you can see here that I basically took off the white border and the gold border, and of course I took off a little bit of that inside border, and that is again just to make sure that I'm actually getting all of the orange. I'd rather err on the side of caution than to not get enough of it. You can see here the backs are gonna look fine, I think, when I'm done. So I'm just gonna go ahead and finish cutting off the two sides, because we're just gonna basically repeat this process, and then we'll check back in and take a look at the top and bottom. Okay, so I have finished trimming the sides off of all the decks, and already I think it looks a lot better. It's also a nice size, because before this deck was actually closer to like oracle size than it was tarot size, and now it feels a bit more like a tarot in my hand. I did get really close, and I realized that I didn't do my usual look for the longest word thing, and I don't know why that totally skipped my mind, but you can see here on Death or Transformation that I got really close to the edge of that title. There's really no space to, no room for error where that was concerned. And I probably should have looked and paid more attention. You know, as many decks as I've trimmed, I still have times where like I forget one step of the process. And one of the most important steps in this process of trimming a deck is actually going through and looking for the deck there, or the card that has the longest word, because when you're trimming, you want to make sure that if you're getting really close to those edges, that you're not going to accidentally clip off a letter or a word or a piece of a letter. I got lucky. Let's just be honest. I got lucky, and I should have looked beforehand. So that's, you know, one of those lessons learned, that it came out okay for me. I got lucky with it. So I'm glad that it did end up coming out all right, but I should have looked. That was shame on me for not looking in the first place, as I normally would have. So that being said, moving along, now that we've got the sides off, you can see I've taken the kind of gold border off the sides too. And then the reason I did that is because it's just a lot, and I'm trying to get it down to as little border as possible. But I do need to keep, you know, some of the gold, because I want to keep the word. So that was why I decided to go ahead and trim it down to the two sides, and that just leaves the gold border at the top and bottom, and I'm okay with that. So basically what I'm going to do is repeat the process, but this time I'm just going to take the white border off, just trim my top off, and you can see there I took a little bit of the gold off the top, but again, that's just because I like to err on the side of caution. But then I can pretty much just start throwing cards in here, and it does really make the process go a lot faster. I do make sure, especially because these are really thin, quite thin cards, and they have a tendency to kind of bow up on the trimmer. I do kind of make sure that I make multiple points of contact with the card, just to keep it nice and straight and flat against the board. Because otherwise, if you get a card, I don't know if you probably can't tell, but the two corners here are kind of bowed up against the board. And that's because this is a pretty thin, flexible, flimsy cardstock. And so by making those multiple points of contact there, I can actually make sure that my card is flat against the board and that I'm getting a nice straight trim. So that's the process that I'm going to do for the top and bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and finish it up. Then we will take a look at what we've got, do some corner rounding, and talk about the edges, some color on the edges. Okay, so here we are. I have finished trimming all of the white borders off. I took the excess off the sides. Look at that. Doesn't that look kind of cool? Kind of like that. Apparently I mixed a few cards up there, but that's okay. So the backs actually look really nice too. They came out nice and straight. The deck itself came out nice and straight for the most part, you know, because I used those measurements. You get a nice clean straight cut, and I think that's really wonderful. So why I take the time to do it. It's actually, I've had people ask me, it's actually faster because once you get those measurements set up, you can just really cycle the cards through so much faster than trying to basically freehand or just eyeball your measurements. You just pop in your card in there and you get this beautiful straight cut every time. So I highly recommend it. It's the way I trim all of my decks now. Going back to that, where's that transformation card. This one, now that I'm at this point, is going to be my issue when it comes to corner rounding because that end there is right up in the corner, and I don't think there is any way that I'm going to be able to trim this deck where I'm not going to probably get a little piece or part of it off. Now, one of the things that I can do is take just a piece of index card here, and I can go ahead and trim a corner, and I can use that to see. So if I use the small one, and you probably can't see it, but I will only get the tiniest part of that end taken off. I would prefer to use the medium. Obviously, this one isn't cut straight. I would prefer to use the medium. That is going to get me more of the end cut off. And I just kind of have to decide at this point. It's also going to cut a little into my X. Whether I want to go ahead and do the small corners and just have it be a bit more square, or I want to try and go ahead and use the medium and just know that on this particular card, yeah, some of the lettering is gonna get clipped off. I mean, it's not much. We're talking like minute little slivers here, but it's gonna look weird in comparison to the rest of the cards. And that just is what it is. I think we're just gonna go ahead and, you know, I'm just gonna live with it. It's cool, it's one card. They don't always come out perfect, right? It's not always a perfect process. Sometimes I make mistakes. Sometimes I'm not paying close enough attention. It happens. So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna start with the small, and I'm gonna go ahead and clip it because I can always change my mind and go bigger with the medium. So I'm going to see what I think about that. And I think that's going to be fine. I would have liked a little bit, you know, larger corners just because it makes for a little bit softer. The larger the corner you go, the kind of softer feel it gives the deck. Just kind of softens up the edges a little bit more, where this is a little bit more square. And again, because I'm working with the small, I can always go bigger. I'm going to go ahead and try a few. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up rounding the corners of this deck, and then we'll take a look at color. Okay, so I have this deck all trimmed up and rounded and ready to go, and I do have to say I quite like it like this. I think the images, just like as we always say, right, they really pop this way, and I like kind of the little effect you get on the edge. It'll be, I think, prettier once I mix them all together. The backs, I think, came out really nicely. Looks much better than, say, what was on it originally, which is this with the big white border. So I have decided for this deck, a lot of times I try to match the back, but I feel like the blue, if I were to try to match the blue, it just really doesn't work with the overall color scheme of this deck, which is very much in the kind of earthy tones. So what I'm going to do is actually do the tea dyed, because it actually comes out fairly close to this color, and then I might overlay it with a little bit of gold just to kind of catch this little gold accents on the back. Not that these are really, they're not metallic, but I thought it might be kind of cool. So I always kind of go into it with a rough plan, like an idea. sometimes that changes along the way. But I always kind of start with my basic plan, my basic idea, and I kind of let it evolve from there. I almost always do multiple colors anymore just because I find that to be a lot of fun, and I really enjoy the process of creating really interesting sides on my deck. But just doing a single color too, just to kind of, you know, cover up that raw edge that I've cut, works really beautifully too. Now, do you need to do this? No. Edging a deck is totally for aesthetic purposes. I have never found that it does any sort of, or makes any sort of difference to the actual card itself. It doesn't like keep it from fraying or anything like that. Maybe somebody else who's been trimming, you know, longer than I have may have some different ideas, might have some more experience. But in my experience of the last year or two of doing this, I've found that edging is completely aesthetic. So I do it for fun because I enjoy it, and I enjoy the way it makes my decks look when I'm done. It's also a great way to really personalize my decks. So to start with, basically I'm going to take my little distressed stamp tea dye here, and I'm just going to go through and I'm going to color my edges. And I'm just going to color them in like this. One of the reasons that I like the distressed ink is that it wipes off the excess, any excess that I get wrapping around the front or back, I can wipe right off. There's nothing that drives me more crazy than trimming a deck and then taking the time to edge it and having my edging wrap around the back of my deck. That is totally personal preference. I know a lot of people don't mind the micro border. Some people really like the micro border. For me, since I've taken the time and put in all the effort to basically get rid of a border and make a borderless deck, it irritates the living crap out of me when my ink wraps around the back and I get a micro border. Again, that's personal preference. Like you can see, well, I don't know if you can see, but may not show up on camera. But this definitely gets a micro border around the backside. However, because it's stamp and not marker, it takes a minute to dry. I have plenty of time to wipe it off so that I get only ink on the edges. So I'm going to go ahead and finish edging this deck in my base tea dye, and then we'll kind of take a look and see what I might want to do to it after that, or if I just decide. Sometimes I just leave it, but usually I like to do something a little bit decorative on the edges when I can. So now that I've finished adding the distressed ink to the sides, you can see here that we've got a really nice color match to the border on the front. It did come out a little bit darker than I intended, but I'm actually going to add some of the gold overlay onto it now. So hopefully that will lighten it up a little bit. And for this process, I actually take the cards and do them in sections at a time, and I don't usually do that when I'm edging in general. So when I'm laying down my base color, I don't do that. But for adding accent, I found that this actually works the best in terms of not getting like big glops of color in places. So I'm gonna lay one down here to protect my table, and basically what I do is I take a section of the cards and I take a paper towel in the color that I want to overlay, because I'm just gonna add a little bit to it, and I need basically 3 little sections of paper towel to do this. So I have one that I lay it on, one that I use to put the color on, and one that I use to wipe the gold off, because I am going to get seepage in between the cards because this is a very wet stamp. So I'm just gonna take this and I'm gonna add that gold overlay and just rub it along there. And it is going to end up on my hands because I'm, as you can see, touching the cards. Now, because this is a wet stamp, I do have a little bit of playtime before it dries. So at this point, what I'm gonna do is basically go around and just get it off my fingers and run my paper towel around to get off any excess that might have seeped between the cards onto the front or back, because I really don't want gold smeared across the front or back of my cards. So I'm basically just going to repeat this process, doing each in like 3 or 4 sections for this deck, and then we will take a look at the final product. So I have finished my modification of the Goddess Tarot, and I do have to say I quite like it. I think that it looks much better trimmed down to just the top and bottom, the title area or the border area being on the top and bottom, because we do have this multiple border aspect going on. But really what I think came out really nicely is the edging. And I don't know if it will really pick up on camera. I don't usually like to have this light on when I film, but that at least hopefully lets you see the gold shimmer in the cards, because there it shows up really well. Yeah, it's really, I'm quite pleased with the way that it came out. Sometimes just using the plain gold all on its own is a little bit too bright, although I think that would have worked really well with this gold accent we have on the back here. But having the tea dye, I think, really helps to not only darken it, but helps to actually match that border on the top and bottom. And I know I usually say I try to match the backs, but I did kind of want to pull those colors in because I just really think that they're really nice colors. And yeah, I really am quite pleased with the way the color came out. Some of it got a lot of golden shimmer. You can look here, here's the original card, so you can see that I, took off quite a bit. Actually, they were closer to oracle size before, and now they're actually quite a nice size for me. A little bit smaller, I think, than a tarot deck, because look, I can get my hands around them really nicely, and they shuffle beautifully. It's a really nice, thin, flexible cardstock. It does have a lot of good bend to it. And of course, because I'm a riffle shuffler, that's important to me. But I am quite pleased with the way it turned out. I think it looks really beautiful. I wasn't sure if there was just going to be, too much border in this deck, but let's pull a cups instead just to get that pop of blue in there. I was a little bit worried about the sort of multi-border thing that this deck has going on, but I actually kind of like it. I think it looks really beautiful, especially now that I've trimmed it. I think beforehand it was overkill. It was too much. And I do like that the suits, the 4 suits, all have the similar background, so it's really easy to, as you're quickly glancing, especially if you're doing a large spread, to glance and see that these are wands, these are pentacles, these are cups, and these would be swords. I think that's really quite handy, and I do really like that the borders on the majors are all a little bit different. And they really relate more to the imagery that we see on the card, which I think is really beautiful. And yeah, I'm actually quite pleased with the way this deck turned out. This was one of those decks that I was like not actually sure I was going to keep. And so I decided I would go ahead and do the modification first and see if sometimes when I'm not sure if I'm going to keep a deck, sometimes modifying it just really helps me to connect with it. And that's definitely been the case for this deck, because as I was modifying it, and particularly as I was edging it, because edging it for me is a much more labor-intensive process than trimming. I've got my trimming process down to real quick and easy most of the time. The time for me is really spent in the edging, particularly because I do multiple coats and different techniques. And as I was edging it, I was really finding myself connected to the deck. I was really finding myself getting excited to use it and excited to work with it. Whereas before, when it had, this big gigantic card with all of the border on it, it was a little bit more I was a little bit more disconnected from it. So I'm really pleased with the way it came out. I'm really excited to start working with it now. Thank you for joining me for this mod with me. You'll find links for the decks and products that I've used in this video in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this process and will join me again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.